The giant space station that watched over the galaxy's communications suddenly lit up with warning signals deep in the control room. Commander Vexler was having a normal day when something strange happened. His 6 arms moved quickly across the glowing panels as an odd sound filled the room. It wasn't like the usual messages they received from advanced civilizations across the galaxy. Those came through quantum channels that could travel instantly across vast distances. This was different. This was old-fashioned radio waves, the kind of technology that most species abandoned thousands of years ago. Unknown vessel to anyone receiving this is Captain Jake Miller of Earthship Endurance. We are stranded at coordinates 8,472 by 3,328. Experiencing critical system failures. If anyone can hear this. The voice was rough and tired, but there was something in it that made Vexler stop what he was doing. The man speaking sounded exhausted, but he wasn't giving up. There was a strength there that the alien commander had never heard before. The message kept repeating every few minutes. But it wasn't just the same words over and over. Mixed in with the desperate call for help were numbers and equations that made Vexler's large eyes widen in surprise. These humans might be using primitive technology, but their understanding of space and mathematics was actually quite impressive. Around the monitoring station, other alien workers started gathering around Vexler's station. Word spread quickly through the facility about the strange transmission from an unknown species calling themselves humans. Most of the senior officers just laughed it off. Probably just some species that barely figured out radio, said one of the supervisors, waving a tentacle dismissively. They're probably still stuck on their home planet, dreaming about the stars. But Vexler couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. He had worked at the monitoring station for over 30 years, listening to distress calls from across the galaxy. Usually, when ships were in serious trouble, the voices became panicked or hopeless. This Captain Jake Miller sounded tired and worried. Sure, but there was something else in his voice. Determination. Like he absolutely refused to believe that his situation was hopeless. The coordinates the human captain provided were at the very edge of known space, in a region that most civilized species avoided. It was dangerous territory, full of radiation, storms and gravitational anomalies that could tear a ship apart. What was a species with such primitive technology doing out there? As Vexler listened to more of the transmission, he started picking up background voices. There were other humans on that ship, and they weren't screaming or crying like most species would be in a life-or-death situation. Instead, he could hear them working together, calling out technical information to each other. Even occasional laughter. These people were facing certain death, yet somehow they still had hope. The Galactic Council's official policy was clear about situations like this. Unrecognized species using primitive technology were not their responsibility. They had their own civilizations to worry about. But something about Jake Miller's voice kept nagging at Vexler. Against every rule in the book, Vexler made a decision that would change the galaxy forever. He quietly accessed his personal research vessel and filed a flight plan to investigate what he officially logged as Uniswal Stellar Phenomena in the Outer Rim. He didn't mention the human distress call in his official report as his ship launched toward the coordinates Captain Jake Miller had provided. Vexler wondered what he would find out there in the darkness of space. When Vexler's ship finally reached the coordinates, what he saw made his blood run cold. The human vessel was barely holding together. Large chunks of metal floated around it like a debris field. The ship's hull looked like it had been through a war, covered in burn marks and holes that were leaking precious atmosphere into the vacuum of space. His sensors showed life signs aboard the damaged ship, but they were weak and fading. Whatever had happened to these humans, they didn't have much time left. Vexler had seen plenty of disasters in his career, but this ship looked like it should have been destroyed weeks ago. How were these people still alive? Prepare the rescue pods. Vexler ordered his crew full medical team. Emergency life support equipment. These beings are in critical condition. As they approached the human ship, Vexler expected to find the usual scene of a disaster. In his 30 years of space rescue operations, he had seen it all. crews huddled together in terror, species fighting each other over the last scraps of food and oxygen. Leaders who had completely broken down under the stress. It was always the same sad story, but when Vexler's boarding team cut through the airlock of the human ship, they found something completely different. Instead of panicked survivors begging for rescue, they were greeted by a tall human male who stepped forward with a tired but genuine smile. "Thank goodness you got our message," said Captain Jake Miller, extending his hand in what Vexler would later learn was a human greeting gesture. "I'm Jake, captain of this ship. We're really grateful you came all this way to help us." Behind Jake stood a woman with grease-stained clothes and tools hanging from her belt. This was Lisa Thompson, their chief engineer. Instead of collapsing with relief at seeing their rescuers, she was already looking past them with curious eyes. "Is that your ship out there?" Lisa asked, pointing through the damaged hole toward Vexler's vessel. "Beautiful design. I noticed something on our approach scanners though. You've got a small crack forming in your port stabilizer housing. Nothing dangerous right now, but it could become a real problem if you don't address it soon." Vexler stood there with his mouth hanging open. Here was a human engineer aboard a ship that was literally falling apart around her, and she was worried about damage to his ship that he hadn't even noticed yet. "We've got some spare materials that might work for a quick repair," Jake added, already directing his crew to gather supplies. "It's not much, but we'd be happy to help fix that before it gets worse." Lisa was already running her handheld scanner over Vexler's equipment, making notes on a battered tablet. "Your quantum stabilizers are running about 15% below optimal efficiency too. We might be able to recalibrate those for you. It would only take a few minutes." Vexler/rescue team looked at each other in complete confusion. In all their years of rescue operations, they had never encountered anything like this. These humans were literally dying. Their ship was minutes away from complete structural failure, and they were offering to fix problems on the rescue vessel. "I don't understand," Vexler finally managed to say. "Your ship is destroyed. Your crew is in immediate danger. Why are you trying to help us?" Jake looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Well, you came all this way to help us. It's the least we can do. Besides, that stabilizer crack could leave you stranded out here, and we wouldn't want that to happen to anyone." Lisa was already organizing a repair team from the human crew, despite being exhausted and running on emergency rations for months. The humans worked with cheerful efficiency to help their rescuers. They shared their remaining medical supplies, offered technical expertise, and even insisted on making sure Vexler's crew had eaten recently. As Vexler watched these incredible beings put everyone else's needs before their own, even in their darkest hour, he realized he wasn't just witnessing a rescue operation. He was seeing something that would change how the galaxy viewed courage, kindness, and what it truly meant to be civilized. Once the translation devices were working properly, Vexler finally got to hear the full story of what had happened to these remarkable humans. What he learned made him question everything he thought he knew about survival and the limits of determination. The ship Endurance had started its journey 4 months ago, with 200 colonists aboard, heading to a planet called Kepler 4, for to be where they planned to build a new home. It was supposed to be a routine 6-month journey, using well-tested technology. But space had other plans. Jake Miller sat down across from Vexler, in what used to be the ship's dining hall, though now it looked more like a workshop filled with makeshift repairs and salvaged equipment. His face was thin from months of reduced rations, but his eyes still held that spark of determination that had caught Vexler's attention in the first place. "Everything went wrong at once," Jake explained, running his hand through hair that had grown long during the crisis. "We lost our main engines first. Then the navigation system started glitching within hours. We were looking at complete life support failure. Most species would have started preparing for the end right there, but humans, as Vexler was quickly learning, were not like most species." Lisa Thompson appeared beside them, wiping grease from her hands with a cloth. that had clearly been repurposed from someone's clothing. Her engineering uniform was patched in dozens of places, but she wore it with pride. "The captain here wouldn't let us give up," she said with obvious admiration when I told him we had maybe a week of life support left. He just looked at me and said, "Then we better get creative." What followed was a story that Vexler would remember for the rest of his life. These humans had literally torn their ship apart to rebuild it into something that could keep them alive. Every piece of furniture had been dismantled for raw materials, decorative panels became hole patches, personal belongings were melted down for spare parts. Lisa showed him through the ship, pointing out repairs that made Vexler's engineering background recoil in horror. By every rule of physics and engineering, he knew none of this should have worked. Chairs had been converted into air recycling units. Kitchen equipment now helped regulate the ship's power systems. Even jewelry and personal electronics had been incorporated into critical repairs. We called it creative destruction. Lisa laughed, showing him where a child's toy had been modified into a crucial component of their water purification system if it could be taken apart. We found a new use for it. The medical officer, Tom Bradley, joined their tours looking tired but proud. He explained how they had stretched their supplies far beyond what should have been possible. Everyone in the crew was eating 1/4 of normal rations, but they had organized it so that people working the hardest got slightly more food. Nobody complained. Nobody fought over resources. We started rotating people through the remaining cryosleep pods. Tom explained everyone would take turns sleeping for days at a time. To conserve oxygen and food, it wasn't comfortable, but it kept us all alive longer. But perhaps the most incredible part of their survival story was what pilot Amy Davis called their aggressive optimism meetings every single day, without fail. The entire crew would gather in the main corridor for 30 minutes, instead of focusing on their problems. Each person had to share something good that had happened that day, or something they were looking forward to when they reached safety. "It sounds silly," Amy admitted with a grin, "but those meetings kept us sane when you're forced to find something positive every day, even in the worst situation imaginable. It changes how you think about problems." Vexler ran the calculations in his head multiple times, checking and reaching his math by every scientific model he knew. These humans should have died months ago. The odds of survival under these conditions were so small that his computer couldn't even display them properly yet. Here they were, not just alive, but still maintaining hope, still working together, still believing they would make it home. As he looked around at the impossible repairs and listened to their incredible story of cooperation under pressure, Vexler realized he was witnessing something that would change the galaxy's understanding of what intelligent life could achieve when it refused to surrender. When Vexler returned to the Galactic Council headquarters, he carried with him something that would shake the foundation of everything the galaxy thought it knew about intelligent life. His report about the humans wasn't just another first contact story. It was evidence of something that challenged the basic assumptions about survival and cooperation that every species in the galaxy had accepted for thousands of years. The council chamber buzzed with heated arguments for weeks. Representatives from 847 different worlds gathered around the massive circular table, their voices rising in disbelief as they reviewed Vexler's detailed recordings and censored data from the human ship. "This is impossible," declared the representative from the Korthak Empire, his scaled hands slapping the table in frustration. "No species prioritizes others over themselves during a survival crisis. It goes against every evolutionary principle we understand." The scientific community was equally divided. Dr. Zixara, from the Vegan Research Institute, spent days analyzing the engineering modifications the humans had made to their ship. Her conclusion was simple. By every law of physics and engineering, we know their ship should have exploded the moment they started these modifications, yet somehow it worked. But while the council debated whether the human story was real or some elaborate hoax, something unexpected began happening across the galaxy. More human ships started appearing. The first sighting came just 3 weeks after Vexler's report. A human vessel arrived at the Proxima mining station, one of the most dangerous industrial sites in known space. The station had been dealing with a toxic gas leak that was slowly poisoning the entire facility. Every major species had sent experts to try and fix the problem, but the radiation levels were so high that even the most advanced protective suits couldn't keep workers safe for more than a few minutes. Captain Rick Johnson and his crew of 12 humans arrived in a ship that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts. When the station commander explained the situation and warned them about the deadly radiation, Rick just smiled and said, "Sounds like exactly the kind of problem we're good at solving within 48 hours. The humans had not only fixed the gas leak but had also improved the station's entire safety system. They worked in shifts, rotating through the dangerous areas so that no one person was exposed to too much radiation. When the grateful station commander offered them a fortune in payment, Rick turned it down and asked only for enough fuel to reach their next destination. Of this incredible act spread quickly through the galactic communication networks. Soon, reports were coming in from across known space about humans showing up in the most unlikely places. Engineer Kate Wilson arrived at the Bolex 7 mining operation. Just as their entire excavation system was failing, the problem had stumped the best technical minds in the galaxy for months. Kate spent 3 days crawling through dangerous tunnels, mapping out systems that hadn't been properly maintained in decades. Not only did she fix the original problem, but she redesigned their entire operation to be safer and more efficient. When asked why she risked her life for strangers, she simply said, "Because they needed help, and we could provide it on the outer rim." Dr. Nathan Brooks and his medical team landed on a planet where a plague had been spreading for months. Every other species had evacuated, declaring the situation hopeless. The humans set up a field hospital and worked around the clock, sharing their own medical supplies and risking infection to treat patients that everyone else had given up on. Within 2 months, they had not only stopped the plague, but had trained local medical staff to prevent future outbreaks. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Humans weren't just showing up randomly across the galaxy, they were deliberately seeking out the jobs that other species considered too dangerous, too difficult, or too unrewarding. They volunteered for toxic waste cleanup missions that could kill them. They took engineering jobs on unstable space stations that others wouldn't approach. They provided medical care in war zones where other doctors refused to go. It amazed the galaxy even more was how humans worked together. Unlike other species that competed for resources and recognition, humans seemed to get stronger when they faced challenges as a group. They shared credit for successes and took collective responsibility for failures. Soon, species across the galaxy began doing something unprecedented. They started specifically requesting human assistance for their most impossible problems. The beings that had once been dismissed as primitive were now the galaxy's first choice when facing situations that seemed hopeless. The word spread from system to system, carried by grateful civilizations who had witnessed human determination firsthand. These newcomers to the galactic community were writing a completely new definition of what it meant to be truly advanced. Exactly 1 year had passed since that desperate voice first crackled through space, asking if anyone could hear his call for help now. That same voice belonged to a man standing in the most important room in the known galaxy, the Grand Council. Chamber had never seen anything quite like this. Captain Jake Miller stood tall beside Ambassador Helen Clark, looking out at representatives from 847 different worlds. His uniform was crisp and new, a far cry from the torn and patched clothes he had worn during those desperate months in space. But his eyes still held that same spark of determination that had impressed Commander Vexler so long ago. The massive chamber fell silent as High Counselor Nixtar, a being whose species had been part of the galactic community for over 10,000 years, rose to address the assembly. His ancient voice carried across the vast room with words that would be remembered throughout history. In all our recorded history, he began, his words being instantly translated into hundreds of languages. We have never encountered a species quite like humanity. They have shown us something we thought was impossible. A civilization that becomes stronger when facing its greatest challenges, and more generous when resources are most scarce. Behind him, a massive screen lit up with the recording of Jake Miller's original distress call. That tired, desperate voice filled the chamber. But now everyone who heard it understood what it really represented. It wasn't just a call for help. It was the first announcement that something extraordinary had arrived in their galaxy. The story of how humans had spread across known space and just 1 year had become legendary. They hadn't come as conquerors, seeking to dominate other species. They hadn't arrived as refugees begging for charity. Instead, they had appeared wherever the work was hardest and the danger was greatest. Captain Bill Thompson and his engineering crew had prevented the total collapse of 3 different space stations, working for weeks in conditions that should have killed them. Dr. Rachel Foster had saved an entire planet from a virus outbreak, spending months in quarantine to develop treatments that she freely shared with anyone who needed them. Lieutenant Alex Turner had led rescue missions into collapsing mines, saving hundreds of beings from dozens of different species. What impressed the galaxy most wasn't just human bravery or technical skill. It was their attitude toward impossible situations. When other species saw problems with no solutions, humans saw puzzles waiting to be solved. When faced with disasters that made others retreat, humans rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The cultural impact had been just as remarkable as their practical contributions across the galaxy. Children were learning human phrases that had no equivalent in their own languages. Never give up had become a rallying cry on worlds facing natural disasters. Stronger Together was painted on the walls of community centers throughout. Dozens of star systems, young beings from species that had been enemies for centuries, were now working side by side, inspired by human examples of cooperation under pressure. The human concept of helping strangers without expecting anything in return was spreading like wildfire through civilizations that had forgotten such ideas were possible. On the industrial world of Kepler 9, workers had started organizing what they called human-style problem sessions, where instead of giving up on difficult challenges, teams would gather to brainstorm creative solutions. The productivity increases had been so dramatic that other worlds were adopting similar approaches in schools throughout the galaxy. Teachers were incorporating human stories into their lessons about ethics and cooperation. The tale of the Endurance crew's survival had become required reading for young beings, learning about leadership and teamwork. But perhaps the most profound change was in how different species viewed their own limitations. For thousands of years, galactic civilization had accepted that certain problems were simply unsolvable, that some challenges were too great for any reasonable being to attempt. Humans had shattered that assumption completely. As Jake Miller stepped forward to address the council, his voice carried the same quiet strength that had first caught Vexler's attention. "We didn't set out to change anything," he said simply. "We just refused to accept that being in trouble meant we had to stop helping each other." The chamber erupted in something that had never been heard before in council history. Representatives from 847 worlds giving a standing ovation, not for a military victory or technological breakthrough, but for the simple idea that no one should face their darkest moments alone. That original SOS signal, once a cry of desperation, had become the galaxy's new anthem of hope.